I'd like to welcome you here to our day-long J. Bonner Ritchie Peace Conference with the theme of Healing Conversations. And my name is Lynn England. I direct Peace and Justice Studies here at UVU. And we have some propaganda on the table in the back of the room if after the presentation you're interested. This conference is co-sponsored by us in Peace and Justice Studies, and then the UVU Ethics Center and the Center for Constitutional Studies here at UVU. And this wouldn't be possible without the collaboration of those three institutions here at UVU. I want to express gratitude to our student assistants, Lizzie Hales and Luyoko, for their support and effort with us. About 4 years ago, a group of UVU faculty members who had been involved with Peace and Justice Studies sat down together, and we were deeply concerned about what was happening almost worldwide. And that was that people were increasingly finding it impossible to talk to other people civilly and with skill. And we were always ending up, whether it was at a Thanksgiving dinner or in the U.S. Congress or the United Nations, we were ending up in name-calling and insults rather than in being able to talk to each other and understand one another and come to some kinds of reasonable agreements. And so we decided that we would institute a program where one day we would hold workshops where we would train people in how you communicate and how you work across really serious kinds of divisions. And then we attached it to this J. Bonner Ritchie Peace Conference that we've conducted for several years. And we hold the workshops, we held them yesterday, and then we're holding this conference today. And we'd like to invite those of you who are here for the first session that you consider staying to the other sessions as well. We have brought in 5 people who are very skilled. They understand the ideas behind peace building, and they practice them in their own professional and personal lives. And so we have a variety of presenters who will be here through the day, and I think each one of them will have something that you would find interesting. And if you do have time, we have programs for the entire day on the back table that you can also access. I wanted to say very briefly a little bit about this conference. Carries the title J. Bonner Ritchie Peace Conference, and it's to honor J. Bonner Ritchie. Bonner was born in Heber City. His parents, when he was fairly young, decided to move to San Francisco, so he grew up with the exposure of a good old rural Utah town and then a San Francisco. He served an LDS mission in the eastern states, and then he served in the U.S. Army for 4 years. He then went to University of California at Berkeley, got his bachelor's degree, and then a PhD in organizational behavior. He went from that to a faculty position at the University of Michigan. And this was during the civil rights era in the early 1960s, and he organized graduate students at the University of Michigan to go to the southern states and to participate in voter registration and in some of the marches there. After 7 years at Michigan, he came to BYU and there he was part of the initial faculty in the Department of Organizational Behavior in the business school. While he was there, he became interested in the Middle East, and he spent much of his spare time traveling to the Middle East and working there to try and establish peaceful connections between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And he became very close to Yasser Arafat during the time that he was there. And then he was also instrumental in establishing the BYU Jerusalem Center because of his connections in working with both the Palestinians and the Israelis. And he used to talk about the number of times that he was shot at by both sides as he tried to work with them. Bonner passed away last year, and that's the reason that I'm telling you so much about him in memoriam of his service. And sort of his local signature was that he was a devout Mormon who was appointed to be the chair of the Utah State Liquor Commission at a time when that was a very, very difficult topic, because the LDS Church, through the legislature, was heavily controlling the availability of liquor, and Bonner was on the commission that was tasked with making it available. And he, with his great skill and personal characteristics, was able to make enormous progress in working through this long-lasting conflict within the state. So I'd like you to at least recognize Bonner and his contributions, both globally and then to the state of Utah. And finally, just as a genuine, caring, and skilled peace builder here in Utah. In the last few years of his life, he was a distinguished scholar here at UVU. Now, the lecture for the present, we have the privilege of having with us Carl Stauffer. Carl has spent his career involved in a number of very important kinds of efforts at reconciling groups of people who have been in hostile conditions and working through their issues, trying to establish a kind of lasting peace with the people. He has done this in Vietnam, where he, after the war in Vietnam, he has been working, bringing veterans from the United States who fought in the war in Vietnam to Vietnam, and then having them work with the people there who lost family members to the war. And Carl works at bringing them together and helping them to both resolve the personal issues that come from the war, and then bringing together veterans with the Vietnamese people. He has also been involved in Colombia in doing similar kinds of things, where there was a long-lasting conflict there, and trying to bring a sort of lasting reconciliation between between sides that have been killing each other for years, and the task of trying to bring them to understanding and positive relationships. It's a real privilege for us to have Carl. He recently published this piece called Peaceworks, where he talks about the experience and work that they have done in Vietnam. And if some of you are interested in this, there are copies of this available on the back page as well. We are grateful to Carl for being here, and I think that you'll find him to be a very inspiring and insightful presenter today. So, Carl.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Lynn, for that welcome. And it's so wonderful to be here with you. And this view is completely distracting. And So I was tuning in and out. But Lynn, thank you so much for the work that you do. I want to say that, in the team and what's happening here at UVU. These are important conversations, and it's been a real privilege to be here now, maybe for the fourth time. So it's a real honor to be in your midst and to be able to present to you this morning. I'm going to feel a little hampered by this. I don't know if I'm going to take it off a few times and walk, but I'll try to behave myself. Anyway, thank you. And as Linda said, my name is Carl Stauffer, and just by way of a few things before we start the input, I am currently working for the United States Institute of Peace. And if anyone's following the news, we're in a unknown period of time in the process of the government cutbacks, and so simply to say this, we are in very sensitive legal processes right now. So I'm going to invite us. I'm going to ask that we not discuss USIP's current status, just because of the sensitivities we're currently under in this moment. So, with that note, let's go on to the pathways to reconciliation, how Americans and Vietnamese have transformed their relationship. Now, most of you in this room, I'm imagining, weren't even born when the Vietnam War happened. And so you're probably wondering, why are we talking about this 50 years ago there was a war, 30 years ago there's been bilateral relationships between the US and Vietnam. So I hope I can fill that with you. But one of the things that happened in this work, Congress funded a project called the Legacies of War, because it realized that even 50 years later, there was still more that needed to be done in order to reconcile Vietnam and the US. And what was that more? We are still cleaning up Agent Orange dioxins that were sprayed to kill the foliage during the war. Unbelievably, there's still contaminated spaces and places on that. Secondly, there's still demining needing to happen 50 years later. There are still unexploded ordinances that are across the country. And there's very few people being maimed by them anymore, because that work has been done very well. But we want to get that down to zero. There shouldn't be children, even if it's 1 or 2 or 3 or 7, being maimed by landmines. And then most importantly, there's the disappeared and the remains of the disappeared and the families that have never had answers to what happened to their loved ones. And for those of you who don't know the Vietnam War, we lost 50+ thousand combatants and soldiers in that war. The Vietnamese people, including their combatants as well as civilians, lost up to 150,000. And so this is a lot of work that needs to be done. And what's beautiful now is the governments of Vietnam and the U.S. are working together and using significant advances in technology to be able to find these disappeared and bring them together. So that's just a little bit of background as to why we're talking about Vietnam here in 2025. This is a significant year because this is actually the 50th year anniversary since the war ended in 1975. And then for 20 years, there was no bilateral relations. In fact, there was an embargo by the U.S. on Vietnam. And in 1995, that embargo was lifted and relationships were restored, bilateral relations. And just to show the impact of this process, and I'll get into the more details of that, in 2022, President Biden signed the highest level of partnership between any two countries. It's called a comprehensive strategic partnership. And this involves a whole set of exchanges, both at a trade and investment and business level, but also at a social and cultural level. And so we'll be talking a little bit about some of that process. The reason we decided to write this, along with all the other activities that were being done, and I'll mention some of those as we go, is that no one had seriously looked at this as a reconciliation case study. And even though, I think it was because it was so drawn out, and there was bits and pieces of goodwill all the way through, but we had failed to really look at this as a comprehensive example case study of how reconciliation could happen. Hopefully it wouldn't take 50 years. So we're trying to put that into publication, or that's what we were trying to put together in this publication. This does not only have professional interest to me, this is a personal interest of mine. I was born and raised in Vietnam. My parents were there with the church, not the military. So in 1964, when I was born, the height of the war, there was all sorts of bombing going on and so on. My parents lived in Saigon, and we lived there. And we didn't leave till about 3 weeks before Saigon was taken over in 1975. So I spent the first 10 years of my life in Vietnam, immersed in that situation. And the war obviously affected us all in different ways. The fighting came into the city, for those of you who are history buffs, in 1968, what was called the Tet Offensive. Tet is the Lunar New Year celebration in the Vietnamese culture and calendar. And the fighting came in a very surprise attack from the north. They used tunnels. And we only found out later that the fighting came within about a half mile of our home. We knew it was close. There was an Army helicopter above us with continual machine gun in a battle with a petrol station, which was taken over by North Vietnamese soldiers. I remember crawling under the bed, my mom praying and singing and reading stories. When the house was shaking, we heard the whirl of munitions above us. And of course, the empty bullet shells from the helicopter in their firing were falling. And I remember as a child that sound of them falling on the tin roof. These are the things that war does. It leaves these various impressions even as a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. My father was continually listening to the transistor radio. God, it's so old I can't even say it. And trying to figure out the curfews in the city and where the fighting was most intense. And eventually a young neighbor girl, 13-year-old, realized that we were there, broke curfew and came over to our house and told us of a way to get out from behind our house through some back alleys that we had never used before. So our family of 5 piled on a scooter and made our way out through an informal settlement and to another part of the city where the fighting was less severe. We were able to return to our home 3 weeks later. But war affected me, and I say that to my students over and over again. Why am I in this work? People ask. I have to start there because this has built a passion for me around this work. And that passion was really solidified when I was studying my master's degree in peace building. And I'd never taken the time to reflect fully on my experience of being a child in war. And one of the most poignant memories I have is after this Tet Offensive, my father went out and took photos. He was determined to tell the story that might not be making the news. Burnt out tanks, damaged buildings. But one of the pictures, a black and white still, and I don't want to trigger anyone here, was of a dead Viet Cong soldier, a North Vietnamese soldier. They wore all black, so that's how they were identified. Feet were tied together, and he was being dragged behind an army jeep. And people were lining the streets. And that picture seared itself in my conscience, and I never knew as a 5 or 6-year-old exactly what I was processing. And it wasn't until I was studying peace building that as I began to work through my own feelings and what I was studying and learning about conflict and war and violence, that I realized there's something gone really, really bad. We have lost a great deal of our humanity when we get to the place where we celebrate our victories on the desecration of the enemy dead. And so that became sort of my mantra. How am I going to live and be in the world in a way that tries to protect and keep us from getting to that place of such deep inhumanity and such deep violence against other human beings? So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about reconciliation broadly, so that you know how we applied the theory of reconciliation and its practice to Vietnam, and then what happened specifically in Vietnam, and then some of the lessons that we've learned along the way. The first thing is reconciliation. It's an intangible. It's really hard to get our heads around sometimes. And there's many definitions, and I'm not a big definition person. I'm not going to spend a lot of time arguing about it, but this is how we've been working with reconciliation in this particular case and in general. Reconciliation is the construction of a social political cohesion, and of course there's a whole set of unpacking of all of that, at an individual, family, communal, national, and interstate level. Now, by constructing cohesion, we mean at least three things: restoring meaningful relationships, nurturing the idea of a common good. In our individualistic society here in the West, we often don't have a concept of the common good. And the common good is literally this: that there are good things that we may deny ourselves of for the sake of the community, or the nation, or the state. That's what the common good is. There are times when we will submit and put ourselves in an inconvenient or what other way, in order for the good of others, or for the whole of all of us to feel like we're rising together. In peace building, we talk about when the tide comes in a fishing hamlet, all the boats rise together. That's our goal in this work. Third, it's establishing a future view in which all the conflicting parties feel they belong. And this is very important. It's not establishing a future view that everyone agrees on. We'll never come to one future view that we're all going to be happy about. What we can do is work towards a future view that allows all of us to see our place in that future, and to see a place to grow and flourish in that future without needing to diminish others. So why do we use a reconciliation lens, for instance, in Vietnam? There's a number of reasons. There can be many. But in general, reconciliation can increase empathic responses and approaches from all sides of the conflict. And so we thought that was very important because there was a great deal of political goodwill on the side of the politicians in Vietnam as well as in the United States. And we wanted to figure out what were the confidence-building mechanisms, what were the trust-building processes that were happening there. Second, reconciliation can facilitate important socio-political narrative shifts. We were very interested in looking at how have the narratives of the way the Vietnamese talk about the Americans and the Americans talk about the Vietnamese and this whole process, how have those narratives shifted? And we can talk a lot about narrative. It's a fascinating process, but as I was saying yesterday to the group I was working with in the workshop, narratives are important. They're not just belief systems or thoughts. They are ideologically and culturally driven. They're attitudes that we act upon. And so if we build structures and act upon narratives, then narratives are pretty important. The ideas that we have about the world are pretty important, because we're going to act into those for better or for worse. Winslade and Monk are two that wrote a book which I highly recommend called Narrative Mediation in 2001, if folks want to look into this more and more. Third, reconciliation can hold together the paradoxes and the complexities inherent in a recovery from more violence. And what do I mean by this? Violence is messy. Peace building is also messy. It's not easy. There's nothing simple about this work. I have folks over and over again. In fact, when we don't understand this work, we're often, we simplify it. And folks over and over again saying, you know, what are you accomplishing? So many conflicts in the world. Well, this is messy work. And we measure our work in local and provincial and regional terms. And so maybe there is wars here and there, but what are folks, I know for sure, all across the world, I've worked with people and organizations that are continually working for peace 24/7, putting themselves and their colleagues on the line, in the front lines, in order to keep peace and to keep violence at bay. This is how we're measuring what we're doing. The two authors I mentioned here on war violence, Vemuk Volkan is a Turkish descent professor at University of Virginia. He coined the term, all of us live and our nation states are built on chosen traumas and chosen glories. What does he mean by that? He means we choose to tell the story about ourselves and our people and our nation in two ways, and they're biased towards us, both of them. One is everything that every person has done against us. Those are the chosen traumas, and we choose them carefully. We set up holidays around them. And then there's the chosen glories, all the great things we have done. Now, it's not bad to celebrate the great things we've done, and it's not bad to sometimes remember, in order so not to repeat, the bad things that have been done to us. But in that process, we need to be careful that we're not also able to reflect on our own shortcomings and our own role in whatever violence has occurred, as opposed to always othering it. Trullo is a historian, Haitian historian, wrote a book called Production of Power, Silencing the Past, Production of Power in 1997. He's late now, an amazing historian who spent his career really helping to bring back the Haitian rebellion against the French colonizers back into the history books, because it was erased by the French colonizers. They couldn't imagine in the late 1770s that the Haitians could actually organize and chase them off the island. It was such an embarrassment to the colonial powers that they spent a year debating this in the French parliament. And finally, they decided, what are we going to do? We're going to erase it from history. We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to write about it. And we're just going to pretend it never happened. And that was successful for a period of time. And it's only been in the last few decades that this has come into center view of our study of revolutions. What are the dimensions of reconciliation? We often think of past and future. That's normal. That's great. But what we often don't think about is the horizontal and the vertical. What do we mean by that? Horizontal, between people, groups, different sectors, but at that horizontal level, civil society, etc. The vertical is, how do we reconcile as people with our leadership, the governance structures that are above us or around us? And so that becomes a vertical question. And many times we concentrate our resources and our work on the horizontal, which is good, but it never reaches the transformation that's necessary at the governance level. And so we're pushing now to broaden the understanding of reconciliation, that it includes a responsive, good governance that's there to serve the people, not the people serve the government. And so how do we build that reconciliation relationship is critical. Probably the best way to try to understand reconciliation is a spectrum of minimum improvements to maximum, or what we call in academic terms, thin and thick. Thin being, not very much reconciliation being experienced or felt. Thick being a very nuanced, complex kind of reconciliation. So, of course, at the far end of the minimum is the rejection of violence. That's the bottom line. We've got to stop the bloodshed. And if it means separating people so that the killing can stop for a period of time, then we do that. But then we try to make that separation useful in the process of reconciliation. Looking at healing, looking at how do we think about changing narratives, how do we help people to begin to understand the other differently. But rejection of vengeance is the lowest line, the lowest threshold. Next, we talk about tolerance. And while tolerance is really important to keep violence at bay, tolerance is never a sustained long-term resolution, because tolerance is literally, I'm going to restrain myself so I can tolerate you, but at any moment, that tolerance might break, and we're back to the violence. When we start to get into the thicker reconciliation, we're talking about this key pivotal moment, and that is the recognition of the humanity of the other. A colleague of mine who worked with refugee camps after the Balkans War talked about, she knew that people were starting the journey of healing when they started to ask, how can another human being or other human beings do this to me and my family? That curiosity to her was the beginning of the reconciliation process. She knew she was not moving anyone in reconciliation if they came in and day out and said, I will never, ever talk to those people. I don't want to be in the same room. I don't want to see them. I hope they rot. That's a stuck position. So when we can begin to start asking, is there some humanness in the other? In very, very tragic situations, we're beginning a really, really long and difficult but powerful journey of reconciliation. And then there's the apology and pardon, something we all wish we could get at the political level and at all levels of society. We often don't. Our public officials have a really hard time apologizing. But that doesn't mean we continue to call for that. And there's incredible efforts at this. Colombia was mentioned in the introduction. I'm working in Colombia. It's incredible to watch how they've set up a restorative justice process in their transitional process. And that restorative justice process requires the defendants to apologize publicly to the victims. And they have these large hearings where this is happening. It's very powerful. Yes, it's required, but there's been a long process of working through denial and getting defendants to understand the ramifications of what they've done. And so it becomes a very powerful moment, a very symbolically powerful moment for the nation of Colombia to watch this apology process go forward. But if you were to talk to me about what is reconciliation in its best form, in its most deep form, I couldn't talk about it without talking about justice too. Reconciliation without justice is cheap. And reconciliation with justice is challenging and very difficult, but that's where we're hoping for. And so one way to imagine reconciliation in its best form is this idea of common good again, but this mutual justice and collaboration, this idea that we have made a social compact to live together, that I'm going to be concerned about your well-being to the same degree you're concerned about my well-being. Desmond Tutu, I had the privilege of working with in South Africa, where I lived for 16 years in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, used to always talk about his philosophy, the African philosophy, or the South African. It comes in many different forms across the continent, but in South Africa it was called Ubuntu. And it was this idea, and he used to say it so wonderfully. He'd look you in the eyes and say, my humanity's all wrapped up in your humanity. I'm not going to be human unless I'm in relationship with other humans. It's a beautiful analogy. So how does reconciliation happen? Well, there's many areas of study and theory about how we get to reconciliation. I'm not going to give you a lecture on this. We don't have the time for that. I'm going to run through these very quickly. But if you're interested, look into these themes. These would be themes around where I would say there's incredible scholarship being built to look at reconciliation. One is social identity and the idea of identity. Identity becomes crucial to the reconciliation process because we cannot reconcile unless our identity is formed in such a way that our identity stands on its own without us diminishing the identity of others. You can't reconcile if you're still threatened and diminishing the humanity of other people. And so this is critical. Capacity building, some people say that's how reconciliation comes. We build, it's through education, it's through building the skill sets necessary, and all of that's important, but it doesn't stand alone. Contact theory, healthy relationships, says reconciliation happens when people actually get face-to-face, in person, and begin to work out these issues between them as two human beings or many human beings. But the challenge with that is, how do you get to that point? There's a great deal of preparation that needs to happen to get people to the point of contact theory. But we can also do it through material ways. We have worked at reconciliation through the back door, if you will, by getting folks together across religions or across ethnic groups and having them work on a crisis that they both feel strongly about. My friend Gopar Tapkida in Nigeria, in Jos, Nigeria, was able to do this with the religious violence that exploded in 2001 in Jos, he brought together the Muslim and the Christian communities into what he called crisis groups. And they together were trained on how to handle the crisis of violence and what was spreading across the city. And by working together on this immediate violence, it could be a humanitarian project or whatever, they realized, hey, we can work together on this. We can work together on our differences, religion or otherwise. Shared goals theory, the idea if you have shared goals, you can move together. Inclusive peace building, there's reams of research that indicate that the more people who've been affected by the violence, who are brought into the conversation and consulted in the process of peace building, the more likely we can get to reconciliation. Of course, arts and storytelling are critical. Arts and storytelling speak. The arts debate approach speaks to our conscience. It speaks to the unspeakable, and that's where a lot of healing needs to happen. It can come through music, drama, theater, and mime. It's a very important tool that we use in this. And then, of course, trauma-informed healing, recovery, and resilience. We cannot have this conversation if we don't think about trauma as a baseline. How do you reconcile when you're living in hyperarousal trauma? You can't. There needs to be a healing process before we can open the space for reconciliation. And lastly, systems and structures. There's always the great discussion, is this happen individually, one person at a time, or does this happen when we change the structures that are, the structures that have inbuilt conflicts in them, embedded in them, and are unjust and need to be changed? It's both. And we need to be working at both of those aspects of the call and the work. So in Vietnam, what happened? Some of the drivers of reconciliation were Vietnam's multi-directional foreign policy, strategic pragmatism based on common interests. The Vietnam government has a very fascinating foreign relations of policy, foreign affairs. They say, we want to make as few enemies as possible and as many friends as possible. That sounds really simple. It's not. But it's a great starting point. And so this was the beginning of their willingness to reach out to the United States. And they, of course, they benefit from the investment and that, but they're also interested in the relationship and the common interests of security and otherwise in Vietnam. The War Legacies Project that I talked about and the cooperation around it was a basis for mutual understanding, and I'll get into much more detail around that. But we believe, actually, that the case we're making in this is the period of 1975 to 1995 where there was no bilateral relations. There was a tremendous amount of citizen diplomacy that built the foundation for the political goodwill that followed. There were efforts by individuals, policy entrepreneurs in both countries within and outside of the government that helped to move this process forward for sure. And over these last 50 years, there's been an American long reckoning with the costs and mistakes of the Vietnam War. And there are books still coming out, even in the last few years, processing this war. And there are many parts of the war that have not been researched or processed yet well. For instance, the women's role in the war, women on both sides and women in Vietnam. That is not a well-developed narrative or research understanding. So you're going to love these pictures. Back in 1987, just to give you some idea of the citizen diplomacy that we think is just a smattering, there was much more than this. One of the first visits that we know of or contact between citizens was in 1987, a group of educators from the United States, a lot of them connected to Quaker, sent a delegation to Vietnam. There's been humanitarian action extensively through work between vets, helping with wheelchairs, prosthesis, and arms and limbs, and other forms of medical care. And what we see on the other side there is peace trees and the planting of trees by the thousands and hundreds of thousands to reforest areas that were damaged by the spray. There was many building trust efforts between veterans, you can see there, but also we have a number of tremendous allies on both sides and advocates who spoke highly and pushed for the money and the resources to do this work. And one of those was retired Senator Patrick Leahy, and you'll see him walking there with a general on the Vietnamese side of the equation. Leahy was a veteran himself, and there were many veterans, war veterans, that were involved in fact, the beginnings of USIP as an institution. And many of them had said, by the experience of combat, we have decided that we need to figure out tangible, practical, and powerful ways to avoid the violence of war, if at all possible. So let's look at the progress. 3 signposts of reconciliation. In general, I'm applying this now to Vietnam, are dealing with the past, creating new relationships and norms, and constructing more just societies. These are 3 pillars, signposts, whatever you want to call them, guardrails of how we try to measure whether reconciliation is happening or whether we're moving along that road, that journey. In Vietnam, there are some interesting examples of each of these. If you've ever been to Saigon, there's the War Remnants Museum, which is the main museum discussing the war. And if you're in, it's sometimes called the American War on that side, and we call it the Vietnam War. And I think it's best to say it was the U.S. and Vietnam War. But the exhibit always has told the story from the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese perspective. And it was important to hear that story, and it's a powerful museum, and it's one of the places that the tourists track through the most. And in the last few years, the government, as well as those who are curating this museum, have agreed to add a permanent exhibit, which we have been involved with, to look at the reconciliation that has happened in the last 50 years since the war. And we think that's going to be a beautiful addition to adding to the narrative of not only what happened in the past, but what's happening right now to build relationships. So stay tuned. That museum, that exhibit is actually going to be launched this year, soon. Creating new relationships and norms, the citizen diplomacy that I was talking about, and the government leadership of goodwill that engaged in joint action and dialogues across the board. We've seen incredible collaboration on all 3 of the areas that I mentioned to you, searching for the disappeared, the UXOs and the demining that needs to happen, and the cleanup after the dioxin Agent Orange. Not only that, there's been incredible cultural exchanges and student and educational exchanges that are continuing to this day. And through this process that we've been working on in the last few years, we've been working in the area that's probably the least covered, and that is the narrative and the trauma of Vietnamese American communities who fled the violence of the war and those who stayed in the country. And there's a deep rift between the two. What have often been called the boat people were mostly from the South and were deeply affected by the war, but also felt that they were fighting with the U.S. for democracy. And it's been very hard to understand this relationship that the U.S. government has been building with the Vietnamese government currently, because the current government is a socialist republic for them. And so we're beginning to try to have this conversation to see how far we can get in helping them come to terms with this. There are obviously many inside who've broken down that division and who are traveling back and forth to Vietnam with business and other interests. There's even a memorial that's been built for the first time in the last few years in Orange County in California, where there's a huge population of the Vietnamese American groups, and there's advocacy work to be done. Many of the Vietnamese who are here in the United States and who came here after the war were also soldiers that fought alongside the U.S. government, army and military, and they do not have access to the VA, Veterans Administration, and all the veteran benefits that U.S. soldiers are getting. And many of us think that's a justice issue that we need to continue to discuss and figure out what to do with. The third, constructing more just societies, sort of jumped the gun there a little bit, but yeah, the UXO clearance, dioxin remediation, and searching for the wartime missing, all of those are part of the justice equation in this, because these are justice issues. In most cultures, if we've never seen the remains of our loved ones in whatever form or fashion, it's very hard to let go of their memory or let go of and even believe that they've been dead. Many cultures say we need the bones, we need the body, we need something. We need to know before we can let this rest. And so searching for the wartime missing is becoming a critical aspect of our work. The last time I visited Vietnam, we walked up 1,000 stairs in a mountain top area where the fighting was exceptionally vicious, called Hamburger Hill. And at the top, there's a memorial that talks a little bit about the war. But all along the way, as you're walking, you can see warning signs. There was a crash here, and don't go in here. There's still hazardous materials, etc. But my colleague and friend was telling me that just months before that, 2 veterans in their 70s came back to Hamburger Hill, back to that area, because they wanted to try to help the Vietnamese government locate the shallow graves of the dead that they had buried during the war. Now, can you imagine 18, 19-year-olds, all the trauma of that war, now coming back for the first time at 70 and tromping through this forest trying to figure out where there's shallow graves so that they can help find the remains of missing persons and reunite them with their families. This is the kind of work that's going forward, and it's challenging, but it's powerful, and it has healing and just qualities. Here's just a few pictures of some of the memorialization that's happening in Vietnam, and just for you to get a sense of some of that. So I'm going to close with this. What are some of the lessons we're gaining from the Vietnam-U.S. relations and that we think could be applied to other reconciliation efforts? Some of these I've already talked to, so I'll be quick about them. But there's 8 of them here that we produced as part of the publication to say these are some of the key learnings. The first is that in times of separation, citizen diplomacy is critical to bridge gaps and build relationships. So you might think, wow, separation is that time where everyone just wants to stay apart. But separation itself doesn't heal. It doesn't change minds. It doesn't change attitudes. And so being intentional in that separation process is absolutely critical. And the amount of U.S. veterans, peace activists, folks here in the U.S. as well as in Vietnam whose children experienced the deformities at birth from the dioxin Agent Orange chemicals, going to see each other, to exchange and build compassionate connections. These are critical points of reconciliation and conflict resolution and peace building and healing. And many times we think reconciliation comes only at the end of the violence process, after the peace agreement. And I've been making the case now, and I will continue to make the case, reconciliation is important all the way through the peace process. We need to be thinking about the relationships of the people sitting at the negotiation table. Do they know each other as human beings? And is there a way in which we can get them together outside of the hardball political negotiation that they're being involved with? In South Africa, during the CODESA, which was our negotiation for the Government of National Unity, 3-year-long process, 23 different political parties, people walking in and out. It was really difficult, as you can imagine, because they were negotiating the end of apartheid and the sharing of power between the racial groupings. And the church in South Africa, as well as civil society, decided we needed to do something. They weren't invited to the negotiation table. So what they did is they started to invite these political party members to what they called encounter retreats in lodges and small hotels or whatever across the country. They did not tell the media. This was all under the radar. They brought them together. They said there's 3 simple instructions for you to be part of this weekend. The first is leave your political ideology at the door. This is not your time for political platforming. Second, be ready to tell your story as a South African. What did you experience over the last 40 years of apartheid? And then third, be ready to listen to everybody else's story. Those were their 3 simple instructions. And if there was agreement, they came together. And those encounters transformed relationships at the negotiation table. We heard later over and over again. When a delegation would walk out, others would pick up the phone and say, hey, we were together, remember? What can you do to bring your team back to the table for the sake of South Africa? Secondly, we're recognizing the need for both past and future reconciliation. Sometimes in political terms, we want to rush to the future. It makes politicians feel better, like we're just going to rebuild the country. Now that we're in power, we're just going to rebuild, and we're going to start from here and go forward. It's just not possible. We've got to hold the past and the present together, and we've got to work with the past in some form or another before we can even start thinking about the future. But sometimes it's simultaneous, and that certainly was happening in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I remember my son one time saying to his mother, my wife, in the car in the horrific traffic of Johannesburg, which we were always in traffic jams, he said, Mommy, what would it be like if we could go forwards and backwards at the same time? And we laughed about it and we're trying to imagine what he was imagining, some car stretching or something like that. But as I thought about it, I thought that's exactly what we're asking the South Africans to do, go backwards and forwards at the same time. And it's stretching, it's hard. Third, an early emphasis on recovery from war violence may lay the foundation for later multifaceted cooperation. Wow, I think I've lost track of time. Oh, okay. I won't keep you to 11:15, so let me finish this out. I just thought maybe I've been talking a long time. It's hard to listen to myself for this long. An early emphasis on the recovery from violence can lay the foundation for later multifaceted cooperation. What we're saying by that is conjoint healing after the war can be a powerful way to help people come together and to find something in common. If they have nothing else in common, they have this, that violence traumatizes us, whether we're fighting the good fight or the moral right, high ground we think, or not. Violence traumatizes us. And we all share that, no matter on what side of the conflict. And so finding ways to work with that can help to build the foundation for cooperation in other arenas later. Adopt a multi-dimensional approach to reconciliation to protect against geopolitical realignments. Now I'm getting into some folks in here I'm sure are studying political science. And we're getting into, Vietnam is a strategic partner to the US in Southeast Asia. It's a strategic security partner, but also a trade partner, and in many other ways, helping the U.S. Keep a presence that's really critical in Southeast Asia. And what this means is that, again, going back to their motto for their foreign affairs, what is it? Make as few enemies and as many friends as possible. And so Vietnam is this incredible bridge-building country because they've kept this relationship and built this relationship with the U.S., and they've done the same with China. And that's why we're like, what's happening with China? And the last time I was there, I heard a beautiful description to me of a woman diplomat told us, she said, don't worry about China. We've been living with China for a long time. They're like our big brother. We'll handle them. Let's keep building our relationship. Now, it might not be that simple, but it's a fascinating way to begin to look at this work. Fifth, recognize the need for both vertical and horizontal reconciliation. This is an area that's been challenging, both for us as Americans or U.S. to reconcile with our government and what they did and how they did it and how the war transpired and how it affected us, and definitely in Vietnam. The relationship between the people and the governance structures is often challenged and difficult. Sixth, encourage reconciliation dialogues with and within diaspora communities. We cannot forget the diaspora. What happens in all wartime violence is people flee. Migration happens. And the folks that are fleeing just so you understand, they flee at a certain point in time in the violence and in the conflict. And what happens is that violence and conflict, that trauma that I've just been talking about, freezes. It gets frozen in their mind, in their memory, and in their experience. And they go to a new place. They slowly assimilate, but the conflict has frozen back in time. And they're not day to day in their home country seeing how the government is doing this or that, or other people are doing this and that, so they can't track the changes. And they often get caught then in supporting ongoing violence in their country of origin because they feel so strongly about the trauma that caused them to flee. And so we see over and over again around the world, diaspora becoming the communities that are in fact supporting armed resistance movements in their countries. And this becomes really contradictory and messy. And so we have to look at diaspora communities and working with diaspora communities as an intricate part of our peace building process. And lastly, last two, cultivate interdependence in reconciliation. So as I mentioned, this bilateral agreement that's been signed between the U.S. and Vietnam have put us in very interdependent, not only materially and financially and so on, but culturally and promises on how we're going to work and what we're going to do. And that's important. That interdependence is really important for reconciliation to be sustained. And then capitalize on narrative shifts in the reconciliation and make sure we build on those to act in justice, to set up new systems or new structures that could possibly sustain the reconciliation further. And so, of course, narrative shifts always do change. They never stay exactly the same. So when they change, especially for the better, then how do we seize those moments and build peace around them? One of the most startling things about this work is they continue to survey the Vietnamese population writ large to try to figure out how they feel about Americans. And over again, the rating is in the 70s and 80s that they have positive feelings towards the Americans. Blows us away after all that happened during the war. And we still don't understand it. It's a very deep cultural process. The Vietnamese themselves don't know how to explain it. Some of them explain it in a way that sounds close to forgiveness. Others explain it in a way that sounds very much like it's pragmatic. Others say, why bother fighting that anymore? Let's work together to advance both of our causes for the future. It's very much of a joint future look. We're not completely sure, but those narrative shifts have been absolutely critical in getting us to this place. Thank you, and I'll stop on that if there might be a few questions. Yeah.
We have two microphones here, and if you have comments or questions, you raise your hand, so we'll give you a microphone so you can be heard.
Hello?
Yep.
Okay. You mentioned vertical and horizontal reconciliation and spoke a little bit about how, if I was understanding correctly, as the people need to come to terms with their government and what it's done. Can you speak a little more about vertical and horizontal reconciliation and what the horizontal part is, maybe to other people? Or
The horizontal part? Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the horizontal part is what we know the most about. That's what we often hear, like, oh, we got this community to meet this community and work out, whatever at a local government level, or this religious group is having dialogues with this religious group and so on. Those are all, USAID calls it used to call it people-to-people programming, where they were just trying to find ways. They were building that on the contact theory, the idea of getting former conflicting groups together and working together in joint projects or having dialogues or whatever as critical to the horizontal reconciliation that was happening. The reconciliation, none of this work is easy, but the reconciliation at a horizontal level is sometimes more accessible. You know, we have programs and communities, and we have a certain maybe trust, or there, you know, we're part of a community that's in conflict, and so we play an insider reconciler role that's really important. What I'm talking about when I'm talking about the vertical is that many times our governments are the source of the violence, either that we're experiencing ourselves inside the country or in war, interstate war, and coming to terms with that, and then holding our governance structures accountable, which is a challenge. You know, how do we say the government is for the people? We say that. What does that look like? If it's for the people, how do we understand the decision making and the way that government should work? As I said before, are we serving the government, or is the government serving us? And if it's not serving us, how do we call for change? Nonviolently. Let me be clear on that. Through advocacy, through organization, through mobilization, through policy and legislation change. But there are many, many ways that I think sometimes the government excuses itself from that reconciliation process because maybe they hold a certain amount of power or resources, or they're the diplomatic folk in the middle of that all. And so finding our citizens' voice in that process is really important.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi. Yes, we hear you.
Okay. How we can change the narrative for the story of a war?
Yeah.
How we can do it, and how long that takes?
It can take a long time. There's no easy way to do that. We do have certain practices that are being built more and more and used. Just to give some examples. First of all, most of a war conflict is so painful and so traumatizing that we have to start by working with the conflicting parties separately. We can't bring them together right away. Many times that's just not possible. So separately, we may be taking them through healing processes where they're starting to come to terms with their own pain, their own trauma, and that's clearing their mind enough to begin to think about, okay, how can we understand the other side maybe? And if you can get to the place where you bring them together, then you've got to build trust, a lot of trust. And that's from just the way you design and organize and your relationship and how much time you give to that. But some of the activities in that trust building process venture from everything from, we used ropes course, that's like, physical challenges. And we put the police and the communities in South Africa together. And you have to figure out how to cooperate with each element. You have to get over 12-foot walls. This was a way of getting them to realize, hey, we can work together without sitting down and having a dialogue to say, so how are you going to work together? Because more than likely when you sit down and just talk about it, the grievances are going to come forward and they're going to be really painful, and it's going to take us down a negative spiral. We have other ways we work with it. Sometimes the way we deal with history is we might, if we've built enough trust, we actually give the parties on one side of the conflict a map with significant dates where violence or bad things happen. And we know that those dates are going to mean different things to different sides. And we ask them to say, what does that date mean to you? And they write it out. And then we bring them together, and when they see each other's perception of history, they realize, wow, we have totally different ways of seeing the same event. It's as if we weren't at the same event. Now what are we going to do to try to ask the right questions to understand how could that person possibly come to that perception of the date? And not, so we work it that way. As I mentioned, futures thinking, we do a lot of work with future scenario building. So if there's an impasse in the conflict, we may ask people to step back and say, in 5 to 10 years, how do you imagine your relationship? What would you like your relationship to be like? None of us are going to be moving away from this area, so we're going to have to share this area. How are we going to share it in a way that keeps the violence from coming back? These are just to name some, and it's a challenge. It's never easy. The narrative can also be affected by the arts and media. And so we need to challenge our media and the arts communities and culture to be helping to frame that narrative in positive ways. Even with memorialization, one of my greatest challenges with our work in memorialization, like how do we remember after the war? Part of the problem is we usually memorialize in our separate camps. So like in Rwanda, you have genocide memorials that are powerful and very touching, but they're like, this is where the Tutsi this was where genocide happened against the Tutsi, and then there's others that might say there was a massacre against the Hutu, but they're separate. At some point, in my opinion, Rwanda is going to need a memorial that's a national memorial that says to all the Rwandans who have died and suffered over this 100-year genocidal history, which is what they've had. 1994 was not new. It was just bigger than ever before. I think this is okay.
I had a question. So there's a lot of students here, and I've also been a student of, peace and conflict studies. What would you recommend in terms of, say, someone sitting here is really interested in this work and kind of finding their way of being a peacemaker? What would you suggest?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And everyone's journey, I'm going to state the obvious first, everyone's journey is slightly different. But the things that have made this possible for me, and I started as a mediator in the courts in 1991. So go with where your curiosity and your energy is. I had studied social work, but then I got exposed to community mediation and trained in it, and this became a new obsession of mine. And then eventually I got this job in the court, bringing victim and offender together in criminal situations to come up with resolutions. So that was the building ground. You start small wherever you start. We took advantage of this opportunity to move to South Africa. We didn't get paid. It was voluntary work. We were taken care of, but don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about making money now. I'm talking about what that allowed me. It was a small relief and development agency that allowed us a lot of flexibility. And they seconded me to a peace-building organization in South Africa. So I was able to immerse myself with South Africans helping me assimilate, which was perfect. And then we were able to experiment, and I don't want to sound bad. We're not experimenting on people, but we were able to try many things that had potential risk, but we were working with what we knew and with the people, and we were saying, hey, the violence is risky too. Peace building is going to be risky too. It opened up opportunities to practice in ways that I don't know how you can simulate it otherwise. Now, I love practice. Some of you may think, no, my thing is in the background. I like the research, I like the social analysis, conflict analysis, etc. Then pursue that. By all means, we need you. We need you desperately. We need those who are analyzing this conflict and saying, hey, this is what's going on. And it helps us think through our practice. But that was 16 years of practice in the field. Then I came back and did academia. So I practiced 20 years, 10 years in academia, just basically, and then came to my current position, which allowed me to bring both the academics and the practice together and get a little closer to policy, which was something I hadn't experienced. So it's been a progression like that in a positive way, and it feels like really important work. But each of us will take it differently. What I would say is no matter what you're doing, get some experience on the ground. Even if you're planning to go into research, you'll be a better research by getting some experience on the ground. Even if you're going to just if you plan to just teach, plan to teach, you want to go the academic route, get some work on the ground. The best professors, in my opinion, are the ones who can talk from their practice and their theory. And so we tell masters, we used to have a master's program that was, I taught at a master's program that was known for its practice. And we would tell students who would come straight through and then want to go on to PhD, take some time off, get 1 to 3 years of experience in the field, come back. Your master's is going to be much more meaningful because you have something to work with from real life. Yes.
So lots of people in the maybe foreign policy establishment think that peace and war, reconciliation or revenge are driven mostly by realpolitik, so like your own self-interest as a country.
Yeah.
So if it's profitable for you to go to war, you'll go to war, and if it's not, you won't, and you
Sure.
reconciliate. And I mean, you could argue from that perspective that Vietnam is cozying up to the U.S. because they want the U.S. to protect them from their interest in the South China Sea that China is encroaching on. So how much do you think like humanity and like maybe appealing to the humanity of these leaders of these countries, how much can you, to what extent can you get them to act against, I guess, their own self-interest and their, I guess, from their point of view, their country's own self-interest in order to reconciliate, in order to build peace?
Thank you. Really important question, and I hear you exactly what you're saying. Let me just say this from my perspective. I think anytime we have a singular explanation for people's behavior, we're limiting the possibilities. So it's realpolitik, and the idea, the Machiavelli idea that we're all working only from self-interest is important. It's an important idea, and it's important for our analysis. If that's the only way we believe humans do what they do, motivationally, we're going to have a very particular way of moving in the world, and it's going to be limited, in my opinion. Violence isn't simple, as I said in the beginning, and peace building isn't simple. And motivations of human beings in both of those crisis systems is very complex. So for me, what I love about the peace building field is we borrow from multiple different disciplines to try to piece together the possibilities of what's happening. So this Vietnam case study is an attempt to explain both what you're talking about, the realpolitik, but also the realpolitik doesn't always explain goodwill on the part of particular political leaders. It doesn't always explain why citizens get involved and risk their lives going across the ocean or doing whatever they're doing. Why should, if a vet is only interested in his self protection, why would he go over there and put himself back into the village where he possibly killed and massacred people to say, I'm sorry, and try to rebuild and help them do some humanitarian project? We need to begin to broaden and complexify, in my opinion. And if you're going in the direction of, if you're studying political science and you're thinking about diplomacy or this kind of work at that level, beautiful, but you'll be better if you understand the complexities of a multidisciplinary process in violence and in peace building. Thank you. Yeah.